Good evening. How are you?
Evening.
Hey, Josh.
Hey.
And I up you to co-host.
Yeah. Oh, great, I am. Sorry?
Okay. Now you're co-host, you can control share screen, etc.
Oh, phenomenal.
The
Okay.
recording until we're ready to start, and I'm gonna and welcome everybody back to the second session with Professor Shanes. Josh Shanes, our friend and compatriot at Skokie Valley. Josh is a professor of Jewish history at the College of Charleston, where he has researched and written about the emergence of, or the impact of modernity on Jewish identity in Eastern Europe, and Galicia in particular. Last week, Josh talked about the impact of Enlightenment on different strands of religious expression and religious thought and the construction of modern Jewish identity from a religious perspective. And now this week, we'll hear more from a political perspective and the construction of Zionism. Use a chat function with questions, or just wave hello and Josh can control the audio for you to ask. We'll also have time at the end. So Josh, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can play a PowerPoint. Hang on. Share screen, share. And now I should be able to open this up. And from the beginning. Okay. So there we go. So we are talking about Zionism today. And, you know, if we're dealing with Eastern Europe, there's a lot of other political movements besides Zionism. Zionism was actually, in many ways, the least important of them. There were others that were far more important in the day. But, you know, over time, we've become, for various reasons, obviously more interested in Zionism. But one thing I want to correct, or not correct, but maybe argue to push back against what Elliot said in the introduction, is what I'm doing today is continuing what I did last week. Last week, we talked about how Jews had to reconstruct Jewishness in Western Europe in a religious identity sense, right? And it included political visions, right? Those denominations that emerged in Western Europe and America in the 19th century had political ideals connected with them, what it meant to be a Jew, who our allies were, what kind of politics we should follow, what was our nationality, what kind of languages we should be speaking, all those sorts of things. So when modernity comes to Eastern Europe, for a variety of reasons, and the same forces will come to Eastern Europe, the forces of modernity, the forces of that break down the Orthodox community, and the forces of enlightenment will come to Eastern Europe, but they're going to play out differently there for a whole variety of reasons that I can't get into today very much. And instead of reform and conservative and neo-orthodoxy, which are the forms of Jewishness in the West, we're going to see modern Jewish politics, including Zionism, which is my focus today. And modern Jewish politics is going to do the same thing that the denominations do in the West. It's going to reconstruct Jewishness. It's going to tell you what it means to be a Jew now that it's no longer self-evident, right? Now that you've been either emancipated or you're living under this totally new situation, maybe you're not totally free, but at least you're no longer in the autonomous community and you've meant secular ideas, and the world around you is nationalizing, right? Remember, national identities, we'll see in a minute, is a very new thing. And so all of the world around you is nationalizing, and you're trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew, what's expected of you, who are the good and who are the bad Jews, what's the sacred history I want to focus on, what's the destined future, all these basic questions that every denomination of Jewishness, if you don't like the word denomination, say expression or stream or whatever word you like, they all have to answer the same questions, and Zionism will answer them as well. So if you see the title I gave to the talk, Ancient Dream or Modern Revolution, it's going to be a little bit of both, right? It is a modern revolution, but it's going to tap ancient dreams, and it's going to do the same thing that every other form of Jewishness, Reform, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, the Jewish socialists, non-Zionist Jewish nationalists, and lots of others as well, they're going to all do the same thing. You want to imagine all of Jewish history and all of Jewish texts and all of Jewish traditions as building blocks, and they were constructed in a certain way in the pre-modern world, and your 2-year-old toddler has walked into the basement after your 5-year-old has built himself a wonderful edifice and in a lot of fun knocked it down. So the edifice is gone, and all you have left are the blocks. And these Jews have those blocks, and they're real blocks, real texts, real traditions, and they're going to have to put them back together again, and it won't look the same. It can't look the same. They're going to leave some out, they're going to make some new ones, and we'll see how it goes. So that's what we're going to do today for the next 45 minutes or so. So to remind you, Jewish identity before modernity. Jews lived in an autonomous community. It was a corporate society. It was a caste system. In any given place, there was no France or Germany or England per se. There were no Englishmen per se. There were peasants and nobility and towns dwellers of different guilds and, you know, and priests and so on. And there were different ethnic groups in some places, like in Poland. Everyone had their own role, their own charter that delineated what their, you know, who they were, what they could do, what they couldn't do, and so on. And Jewish identity was therefore a corporate identity. It set where they could live, what they could do, and so on. That's all going to break down. And the force that's going to break it down is not just secularism, but above all, nationalism. Nationalism is the most important ideology of the last 200 years, and is mostly about 200 years old. And it's certainly the most important since the 19th century. Nationalists, like all religious fundamentalists, claim to be expressing something that is spontaneous and primordial and real and ancient. But actually, it's a modern construction that requires persistent nourishment. It's not obvious or self-evident or natural at all. And I want to show you a little bit about how it develops and why that's so important for Zionism. You know, if I'm terrible with, I have a little bit of ADHD, so I go off on tangents a lot. But I wanted to say that a day or two ago, I saw somebody write, Zionism is 2,000 years old. It goes back to Jews wanting to go back to Palestine or to the land of Israel. That's nonsense. Zionism is not 2,000 years old. It's barely 150 years old, if even that. It's a very modern idea, as we'll see. And it's connected with this role of nationalism. Now, what is nationalism? So traditional society is breaking down. The traditional caste system is breaking down. And people are trying to organize themselves in new ways. And broadly speaking, I wrote here in the PowerPoint, crudely speaking, there are sort of two strands of nationalism. You have cultural or ethnic or organic nationalism. This is most often connected with a German thinker named Herder, but there are others as well, especially someone named Johann Fichte developed this as well, and other thinkers as well. And here's one example of sort of cultural or organic or ethnic nationalism. The cultural bonds which linked members of a nation into a relational whole were not things or artifacts imposed from above, but living energies emanating from within, shared meanings and sentiments which in time form a people's collective soul. In other words, a nation is an organism. It's an organism, and you're part of it by nature. And you have been going back in time till the beginning of time and until the end of time. There's no choice involved. It's not collected to any political entity whatsoever. No foreigner can ever really join, no insider can ever really leave. That's the organic or cultural or ethnic sense of nation. But then you also have a kind of political or civic or liberal sense of nation, which is essentially a daily plebiscite. The idea that everybody who lives in the state is part of that nation. Everyone who lives in the state is part of that nation. And it doesn't matter who your grandparents were, what the color of your skin is, your religion, your language maybe even, although they expect you to learn the local language, none of that matters. On any given day, everybody who lives in this state is part of this nation. And in different times and different places, different combinations or strengths of these two types of nationalism will appear. People often think of America as being a premium example of a political nationalism. I can assure you it is not. America actually has been from the beginning an ethnic nationalism that defined the nation as white, and the definition of whiteness changing over time. White, and by the way, white and English Protestant in particular. I don't have time to go into that right now, not for this lecture, another time maybe. But there's these two types of nationalisms, right? Now, when does the nationalism come? It comes mainly with the French Revolution. 1789, they overthrow the king and they say, okay, no more do we have subjects of France, where you're the object of the king and there's different castes. Rather, we are all citizens in this new body, the French nation, a civic nationhood, a political liberal nationhood, right? And we don't care what religion you are, and we don't care the color of your skin. If you're here now and you pledge your patriotism and allegiance, you are part of the French nation. They debated a little bit the Jews. Like they had the revolution, and they said Protestants, Catholics, yeah, but Jews, you know, the depth of anti-Semitism and Christian culture, they said, really, the Jews too? But after a year or so, they said, yeah, the Jews too, as long as they pledge their allegiance, as long as they give up all of their autonomy, they're part of the French nation too. So it starts in France and then starts spreading east, literally in the case of Napoleon, bringing the idea east, but also just ideas travel. It wasn't just the French army. And it begins to spread first to Central Europe and then to Eastern Europe. But in Eastern Europe, exploding especially in 1848 when there's revolutions across Europe called the Springtime of Nations, in Eastern Europe, it doesn't work so well, this political idea. And I'll show you why. Here's the map of the states of Europe in 1815, right? So if you look there, England, France, Spain, those are kind of neat borders in a certain sense. But Central and Eastern Europe was massive multi-ethnic empires, right? Look at this map. You see how France is more or less, and Spain and English, these are more or less ethnically homogeneous places. But when you move further east, they are not ethnically or linguistically homogeneous at all. So when nationalism begins to come to these places, the kind of liberal nationalism that we saw or allegedly saw in the West, I mean, there are those who argue it was always a facade, but those who allegedly see it in the West, it's just not going to work. What do you mean everyone who lives in Russia is Russian? That's ridiculous. Russia is this massive empire controlling huge numbers of peoples. Or everyone who lives in Austria, right? Here's the Austrian Empire, which today is 9 different countries, right? What do you mean everyone? There's no such thing as Austrian, right? So instead what develops is a kind of ethnic nationalism. And again, this is all very late 19th century. Ukrainian, Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Croatian, Czech, Slovakian nationalists are going to people who have no idea what a nation is, who are often multilingual, have no real ethnic identity, and they scream at them, don't you know you're an X? Like the Ukrainians would say, don't you know you're Ukrainian? Don't you know the Poles would say you're Polish? Don't you know you're this? And the answer, of course, by the fact that they kept screaming it for so many years is, no, they did not know that. Their identities were local or peasant or whatever. But the basis of that national identity was not going to be state, which made no sense. It was going to be ethnic, kin networks, language, religion, right? All that kind of thing. That's the context where Zionism is going to come from. This is the context. The autonomous community is being dissolved by the multinational states. Austria, Russia, these massive states are dissolving the autonomous community. Jews are modernizing, not necessarily becoming a bunch of socialists. They might still be kind of traditional, but they're modernizing, moving to the cities, beginning to read newspapers, and trying to figure out what it means to be a Jew in a place where people start talking about nationhood and talking about nationhood in categories that might theoretically apply to Jews. That's the backdrop. So what is Zionism? What is Zion? The term, by the way, is only coined in 1893 by Nathan Birnbaum, but it predates that the concept predates him by a few years. Zionism is first and foremost a very mixed movement. It's not like just today where people can't decide. Back then it was very mixed movement, right? You have political Zionists, these are like Theodor Herzl, who said we have to get an international agreement to support this project of the Jews. We'll talk about what the project is in a minute. You have practical Zionists who say, forget the international community, let's just go do it ourselves. You have cultural Zionists who said, we don't care about state, we care about culture. Zionism is about remaking Jewish culture as a secular alternative to religion, a new kind of sort of secular religion, right? You have socialist Zionists, Marxist Zionists, right-wing, left-wing, a very few religious Zionists and of different types, and lots of other kinds as well. There were so many kinds, and I kid you not. You know, I studied Galicia. One of the many variety of socialist Zionists, and there were many, was Poalei Zion, the workers of Zion. Poalei Zion then couldn't hold it together, and they split between regular Poalei Zion and Linke Poalei Zion, left-wing Poalei Zion. But then Linke Poalei Zion split between the Galicianers and their other Polish Poalei Zion. So you had a left, it wasn't just Zionists or socialist Zionists or Poalei Zion socialist Zionists or Linke Poalei Zion socialist Zionists. There was the Galician Linke Poalei Zion socialist Zionists, and then they split into 6 different groups that couldn't get along. If you ever seen Life of Brian, it's like when they're talking about the People's Front of Judea, the James People Front, and each group is like 5 people in it, right? They simply, the plentitude was unbelievable, and there's reasons for that, by the way. But I think I can apply, and I stole this from another scholar, but I think it works, 4 basic principles that apply to all Zionists, but not necessarily all Jewish nationalists. There were Jewish nationalists who believed Jews are a nation, but were not Zionists. And by the way, there were many Zionists who believed Jews were a nation, but were not Zionists. They called themselves Zionists. They believed in the concept of Zionism, but that's not what Zionism was really about for them the way you think it was. I'll show you that in a few minutes. So what are these 4 things? Number 1, most importantly, most shockingly, Jews constitute a modern political nation. This is not what Jews believed before the early 20th century. They started to think about it in the 1880s and 90s. This is not an ancient belief. When Jews saw the phrase Am Yisrael, they were not thinking Am like we think nation. It's not what it meant to them. It meant to them some kind of folk peoplehood, right? But it had no political consequences, no sense of being a nation in the modern player of nations and nation states. But for the Zionists, it did. And that was revolutionary. You didn't have to be religious. And for some Zionists, you could even convert to other religions, and it's no problem. After all, don't we have Jewish Americans and Christian Americans? Why can't you have Jewish Jews and Christian Jews? And I'm not being snide. Aleph Bet Yehoshua. Some of you heard of A.B. Yehoshua, one of the most famous Israeli authors to ever live. He came to my Hebrew class 25 years ago at the University of Wisconsin. He said, we really need more Christian Jews. We don't have enough of them. It would really enrich our... Everyone giggled, but I knew exactly what he meant. Who cares what religion you are? Being a Jew is being a nation. That's number 1. Number 2, the diaspora is defective. Something's not working. Something is not working. It's not going to last long. Number 3, the solution will be to gather the Jews to some territory, maybe Palestine, maybe not. Theodor Herzl thought Argentina was far more likely. Way before Uganda, they were talking about Argentina. Israel Zangwill was talking about Canada. It's a big, big world out there. But eventually they settle on Palestine for various reasons. And finally, the means to accomplish this would be via the principle of self-help. We're not going to wait for God to send the Messiah. We're not going to wait for the Tsar to free us. We're going to do it ourselves. Not all Jewish nationalists agreed with all 4 of these. Many, even self-described Zionists, said, we don't need to go anywhere. Zionism is about asserting ourselves politically right here where we are. right here in Poland, right here in Galicia, right here in Austria, right here in Germany, right here in America, right? A lot of Zionists didn't really care about Palestine beyond it being a symbol. But for all Zionists, true to the name, I think this is more or less what we're talking about. Now, I cannot emphasize enough, these are secular ideologies. These are not religious ideologies, or if you like, it's a kind of secular religion, if you will, right? Why do I say that? I'll give you just a few reasons that could go on for an hour. First of all, the leaders were all radically secular. And I don't just mean Theodor Herzl with his Christmas tree and his son who had no circumcision and his congratulations to everybody, to Max Nordau, his co-founder, who married a non-Jew. It's not just about them. It's through and through. They were radically secular people. It was secular because they were talking about self-help. It was secular because the nation was the key category, not any kind of religious category. And the whole way, you know, we say in Hebrew Hashkafa, or in German Weltanschauung, with two U's, Weltanschauung. It was secular, right? They were worried about the Jews' relationship to other people, not God. Their entire epistemology was secular, through and through. That's why you can't have Zionism until you have the rise of the secular age of Europe and the rise of nationalism. And you can't have the rise of nationalism until you have the rise of secularism and the challenge to the church, right? So for them, Hebrew was not the holy tongue, it was the national tongue. Jewish collective identity was historic. It wasn't religious. The land of Israel was not the Holy Land. It was the land where ancient Israelites used to have a state, right? And the Bible was not a holy book by God. The Bible was a deed that said, look, ancient Jews used to live here and have a state. That was the relevance to all of this. It also, by the way, was not, how do I put this? The extent to which this is a reaction to anti-Semitism is overstated. I don't want to say there was no connection. There is some connection to anti-Semitism, but it's a far more organic, internal movement, which, by the way, Zionists should like because it makes it more authentic for them, I would think. Like the Western denominations, Zionism comes out of the Haskalah, the idea of the Jewish Enlightenment, right? The Jewish Enlightenment does call for integration in Western Europe, which Zionists reject. But the Haskalah was what said, let's look at Jewish history from a secular perspective. Let's glorify manual labor and agriculture. Let's glorify Hebrew language over Yiddish. Let's make a new Jew, right? All of these things. The Haskalah is going to evolve into Zionism in very interesting ways. It's also coming from the fact, why is it born in Eastern Europe and not Western Europe? Because think about what makes a nation in Eastern Europe, right? Large concentrated populations, a unique language, Yiddish, a unique religion, a unique economic role in a place where economics plays a huge role in national movements, right? In Galicia, the Ukrainians were more or less the peasants, the Poles had all the power and the gentry, and the Jews had sort of a middleman commercial role. So when you, in a place where economics mixed with religion and language to make nation, that's where you're going to see people exploring the idea of a Jewish nation, secular leaders. And by the way, what's fascinating is, who are these Zionists who, by the way, for decades, and I spent many years reading literally tens of thousands of issues of their newspapers. And they're screaming for decades, you Jews, don't you know you constitute a nation that has coming to it national rights? And the answer, of course, was no. They had no idea because they didn't yet, right? Becoming a nation for the Jews and everybody else, Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Germans, Czechs, Palestinians, everybody. These are modern ideas for everybody, Jews too. And they're coming there trying to convince the people to think of themselves this way. And by the way, in what language are they doing it for the first years? In Polish, because they were all acculturated Jews with no religious background. They did not know just not know Hebrew. Most of them didn't even know Yiddish. They couldn't speak to the regular people. The Hebrew language papers were published by the Orthodox Jews who were screaming, don't you know you're Polish? So you have Zionists publishing in Polish, telling the Jews that they're a nation because of the Hebrew language. And you have Orthodox Jews publishing in Hebrew, screaming at the Jews, don't you know you're Polish? That's being a Jew is just a religion. That's the irony of Eastern Europe in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, if you're going to convince the people that you're a nation, you got to, yeah, please.
You're saying the Orthodox are saying you're Polish. So I'm taking,
absolutely.
So at least initially, the Orthodox really were largely, or to what extent, non-Zionist or affirmatively anti.
The vast, vast, vast majority of Orthodox Jews, and by the way, Orthodox doesn't mean traditional, right? It means self-aware, self-conscious Orthodox Jews are anti-Zionist until at least World War II, and in some ways till the 1990s, but certainly till World War II. Not just not Zionist, strongly anti-Zionist, and I'll get to that at the very end of the lecture. Strong anti-Zionism is practically the definition of Orthodoxy in the 1880s, 90s, and 1900s. I'll pinpoint the year, from about 1889.
In Poland as well as Lithuania?
Everywhere. Everywhere. There were very few exceptions. Famous ones, but very, very, very few. Very few. Now, for the Zionists to come to the people, a bunch of assimilated Jews, and say, don't you know, we are obviously, remember, what does every denomination want to do? I told you the story last week about how Ismar Shorsh came to my synagogue, Bethel in Highland Park, and gave a lecture called How Conservative Judaism is the Authentic Form of Judaism. And of course, plenty of Orthodox rabbis, if not most, will say, we are the authentic Jews. The Reform conservatives might be very nice, but they're not getting it right. And the Reform Jews come along and say, no, 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 we are the authentic Jews. The Orthodox are a bunch of women haters and so everyone thinks they're the real Jews. By picking and choosing ever so selectively from that big box of building blocks. Remember, your 2-year-old came and trashed the building blocks that existed, and they knocked it all down. And now we're all coming to build. And we all have the same blocks, the same texts and traditions, but we're going to choose them ever so selectively and use them in new ways. By the way, not just Zionists, all the nationalists do this, all the nationalists, because you want to convince people that something's real and it's not real. And I'm not saying it's fake. I'm saying it's constructed. It's selectively choosing and ignoring from our past and our traditions to make a case that we're obviously the real Judaism. And that's what Zionists were going to argue to the people. We're the real Judaism. We know what texts are important and what aren't, what rituals are important and which aren't, who our allies are, who's a good Jew, who's a bad Jew, right? What is a Jew? All these basic questions that every denomination will answer, they answer them too. The healthiest, easiest way to understand Zionist denominations is as denominations, as expressions of Jewishness, of Judaism, or whatever word you want to use. So what are some of the symbols the Zionists tapped into? Well, they certainly wanted to look professional and modern. The Congress itself was very important. After all, they called it a Congress, right? A Congress is a representational, who goes to Congress? Our delegates. There's 330 million Americans. They send 435 members of the House of Representatives, right? There were about 400 people who came to the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And by the way, it was black tie required. You had to wear a tuxedo. It was required. And who did they represent? Themselves. There was no election. This is the entire Zionist movement, basically, right? But they called it a Congress because it made it sound, if you have a Congress, well, obviously you're a nation because nations have Congresses, right? That was the idea. The flag. Now, on the bottom left was an early idea of the flag. You do see the Star of David there, which captures as a kind of, authenticity. The 7 stars around it, nobody knows. I often ask what are the 7 stars. No, Sam, do you know what the 7 stars were? Yeah, the 7 stars were the 7-hour workday because the socialists promised in the future post-revolutionary utopia, there would be an 8-hour workday. So the Zionists said, we'll do one better. We're going to have a 7-hour workday. But it's too confusing. It's too boring. Flags have to be simpler. So you see in the upper right the flag they chose, which of course becomes the flag of Israel, the Star of David, which they appropriate, and the 2 blue stripes, of course, evoke the tallis, right, the prayer shawl. And I want to tell you a story because why not? I have a little bit of time. In the city of Sanz, you heard the Sanzer Hasidim? In the city of Sanz in Galicia, they said, a memoir said in 1900, the most secular man, the most secular Jew in the entire city was a guy who wore only a regular black hat and not a shtreimel on Shabbos. He was the heretic because he didn't wear a shtreimel. He just wore a black hat on his way to shul. But sure enough, what's going to happen with time? The Zionists are going to come. I mean, this is Eastern Europe we're talking about, right? So the Zionists, what's the first thing the Zionists do? The first event without fail they always have? Hanukkah celebration. Always Hanukkah. But not because of the oil. They have no time for that. It's the story of the Maccabees that they really wanted, right? Militant, manly Jews fighting a war for the land of Israel. That's what they wanted. So they unfurl their flag in the marketplace with the Star of David, and they say, come to our Hanukkah party. The rabbi calls an emergency meeting. Everyone to shul. Everyone to shul. They come to shul. And the Rav is said, the Magen David is metome geworden. It's been defiled. It is no longer a Jewish symbol. It is a symbol of the heretical Zionists. And he instructed every man to rip it off their talis bags and their tefillin bags and to take it off the parochas of the Aron. It's no longer Jewish, he said. Ad kedei kach. That night, a 16, 17-year-old Zionist, being a kid, breaks into the shul and carves a Star of David in the shtender of the Rav at the head of the shul. Morning comes, Shachris, the Rav comes in, finds the Star of David. The Star of David, which yesterday was on the Aron Kodesh with the Torah scrolls, finds the Star of David, picks up the shtender, the old man, walks it out of the shul, throws it down the stairs, and says, it's worse than if he had carved a crucifix. The guy was so scared he'd be found out, he fled Sanz, fled Galicia, made his way to Berlin, was afraid of being found in Berlin, and made his way to America. That's how afraid he was. But the Rav was right. Not that the Star of David was defiled, that's a judgment call, but the Star of David had been appropriated. That's what he noticed. The Star of David had been appropriated into a new denomination that is heretical. What else do we have? Liturgy. Doesn't it say in the Haggadah and other places next year in Jerusalem? Don't we end Yom Kippur next year in Jerusalem, right? What does that mean? For 2,000 years, it meant, God, please send the Messiah. That's clear, right? God, please send the Messiah. The Zionists say, I don't know, man. Next year in Jerusalem, right? Are you a heretic? Are you a hypocrite? Get on a plane. El Al will fly you one way for free. What's holding you back, right? They've reinterpreted it. It does say next year in Jerusalem, but that's not what it meant. It's just like when the Chasam Sofer last week, we talked about how he said, Chadash Asur Min Torah. It does say Chadash Asur Min Torah in the Gemara, but it doesn't mean modernity is forbidden, right? It meant something different in its context, but we ignore that context. Here's a propaganda poster. I have a thing for propaganda. I have many, many images of propaganda. For Keren HaYesod, the Jewish National Fund, and it says on the bottom, Alu Urshuas Haaretz, rise up and inherit the land. Yidden, in case you don't know Hebrew, which most Jews didn't, Yidden. Der Schlüssel von Zion is bayich in their hand. Efna aftiteren. Jews, the key to Zion is in your hands. Open the doors. Who's saying that? Is it Isaiah, Jeremiah, Moses, God? I don't know. All of them wrapped up into one. But definitely somebody religious. Definitely somebody from the Torah, right? Moses or something. Isaiah. Go. Just go. Don't be a Christian Scientist. Or like the joke of the guy on the, who's being flooded and God sends the boat and doesn't take the boat. He says, go. It's making it look like a religious thing. Rituals. So you see the Keren Kayemet Yisrael box. We all, even when I'm only 48, but when I was a kid, I still had that blue box, right? Raising money for the Jewish National Fund. It was deliberately constructed parallel to there'd be Meir Baal HaNes fund that Jewish women would give money to on Friday nights. And the Zionists would say, Jewish women, put it by your candles and put a coin in before you light candles Friday night. Now, my grandfather of blessed memory used to always tell me, when somebody says, it's not the money, it's the principle, it's the money. And I respect that's good advice to this day, but I will tell you something about this. It wasn't just the money, it's the principle. They want to elevate giving money to Keren Kayemet as a mitzvah. They want it to be a mitzvah to support the Zionists. And they did the same thing in Galicia. You know, Hasidim, those of you who know anything about Hasidim might know, Erev Yom Kippur, the Hasidim put out plates to collect money, and specifically plates, china plates or glass plates, some kind of a plate. When you plunk your coin on it for charity, that clinking noise breaks the klipa, the bad gzera that would have, doomed you for this year. Many Hasidim believe this, they do it to this day. They put out kairas Erev Yom Kippur. The Zionists put out their plates in the synagogue with all the other plates. And they said, we collected this much money for Zionists, but the point wasn't the money. It was giving us money is a ritual. It's a mitzvah, because this is the denomination of Jewishness, right? Hanukkah we already discussed. They don't have any room for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, like these things we have no time for. Hanukkah was the most important holiday of the Zionist calendar, bar none. Nothing came close to Hanukkah. It was a minor holiday in the olden days. We don't realize this now because of Christmas. It was a very small deal, but the Zionists made it a huge one. They would have massive rallies like this one to try to make people feel like a nation, right? Now, one thing that Judaism is supposed to have, and especially if you want to have a movement connected to national return to Palestine, what do you need is the Messiah. Now, the Zionists don't have a Messiah. He hasn't come yet. Oh, but wait, they do have the Messiah, because they have Theodor Herzl, and he deliberately played himself up to be the Messiah. He nurtured that image, and people called him that. I've often joked, and I'm only slightly joking because I think I might be right, that if Theodor Herzl were clean shaven, there would be no Israel today. And I'm semi-sure that that's true. Right. I'm semi-sure that if he had been clean shaven, it would have been a big blow to the Zionist movement. People talked about him. They said he came to the stage and it was like the Messiah, son of David, had come in before us. It was a miracle happening. And we all screamed out, Yechia Melech, long live the king. He nurtured this. Look at this card here. Oh, hang on, I'm frozen, 1 second. Uh-oh, hang on. Because I looked at this. There we go. Take a look at this. This is the delegate card to the 5th Zionist Congress. Now here we have Theodor Herzl in his tuxedo, surrounded by all the modern European men and women in their nice clothes, right? And here we have, coming from the sky, clearly Moses, with all the ancient Israelites from the set of the 10 Commandments, right? And what's he got? He's got his famous staff, the famous staff of Moses, and he's handing it off to Theodor Herzl. This is not subtle, my friends. This is like a 2x4 across the face. Theodor Herzl is Moses. Just as Moses led his people to the promised land, Herzl will lead his people to the promised land. He is the reincarnation of Moses and the king wrapped up all into one. Now, part of what the Zionists emphasized wasn't just getting the Jew out of Europe. And by the way, I want to say again, most Zionists didn't actually care about going out of Europe. For most Zionists, what Zionism gave them was a way of being Jewish in a proud way that was not. They no longer believed in the religion. They wanted to be Jewish. They wanted to be Jewish in a kind of non-hyphenated way, and Zionism gave them that. Zionists in Europe were very active in local politics, running for office. They served in the Austrian parliament. They made a party. They had a faction in the Austrian parliament in 1907, and they had factions in the Polish parliament between the wars. They were very diaspora-focused. Palestine for them was, for most of them, of course, the famous exceptions like the Second Aliyah, Ben Gurion, and Golda Meir, but for most of them, It was about identity more than anything else. Part of that new identity was to make the new Jew. This is Max Nordau, the co-founder of the Zionist organization. He talked most famously about making a Jewry of muscles. Once again, he says, for history has our witness that such a Jewry once existed. For too long, we've been engaged in the mortification of our own flesh, or rather, others did the killing of our flesh for us. But now all coercion has become a memory of the past. Let us take up our oldest traditions. Let us once more become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men, right? And by the way, there's a lot of misogyny in Zionism I don't have time to talk about, but this is where it's coming from. Zionist makes the new Jew, right? A real Jew, not like the old. And they absorb a lot of the anti-Semitism of their time, that Jews were weak, that Jewish men were effeminate, that Jews were cowards, that Jews couldn't fight. They accepted all of that. The idea that Jews were a bunch of nervous Woody Allens, right? What Max Nordau called coffeehouse Jews, sitting around the coffee house shaking and not being able to do anything. He wants to make real Jews, like Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba, he lost the war. It was a catastrophe. Millions of Jews were slaughtered. It was almost the end of Jewish history. The rabbis universally condemned that and were afraid of that, but not for the Zionists. Bar Kokhba is the hero. A lot of the groups were called Bar Kokhba. He was a hero who refused to know defeat, and when victory eluded him, he knew how to die. That is to say, like a man. He proudly and openly talked about the penises, you know, the famous story of the ancient Jews of the Greek times who had to reverse their circumcision in order to play in the games, in the sporting games. So he says those Jews were cowards. They reversed their circumcision because they were so ashamed. Our new Bar Kokhba Jews show their circumcision proudly to the world. It's quite shocking language if you think about it, right? But here it is, and all the propaganda, you know, they have these gymnastics clubs showing these new manly men fencing and so on. Look at this guy, right? The new Jew's gonna trounce, just walk over Jerusalem. Nothing can stop him. Now, if you wanna ask yourself, who should be the symbol of the new Jew more than anyone else? Who will give us this new identity? Of course, it's Theodor Herzl. Now, the problem is, Theodor Herzl never took any photographs, you know, any private photographs. But that didn't stop the Zionists from imagining what he must look like without his clothes on. So they started drawing pictures. And this is from the journal Alt Neuland, right? A monthly journal of Zionist interest. You see that it's the biblical image of the two spies carrying the giant fruit back. Remember from the story of the Bible, from the book of Numbers? And if you look at the guy on the right, look at his face. That's clearly Theodor Herzl. You see the beard, right? That's clearly Theodor Herzl. And look at him, the guy's ripped. Look at his legs, look at his ass, look at his legs, look at him. The guy's monstrous. He's like Arnold Schwarzenegger or something like that, right? And every image of Herzl was like this. Here's a biblical image from E.M. Lillian, who's another Galicianer. We have the angels guarding the Garden of Eden after the expulsion of mankind. And here you see Theodor Herzl on both sides. Again, it's clearly Herzl. Again, he's ripped. He's like, he could take down 5 Arnold Schwarzeneggers. And by the way, everyone's over 18, so I'm just going to be a little Freudian here, if you'll forgive me, and I hope I don't embarrass anybody. But look at the man's thong, okay? This is a man who's well endowed. I'll just leave it at that. And look at, and even beyond that, you have the sword, which goes down lower to even be even more suggestive, right? This is a man's man. And we have image after image of this. Herzl as Moses, Herzl as Joshua, Herzl as, Aaron, the priest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Always Herzl, our new hero. And here's a propaganda post from Interwar America. Give to the Jewish National Fund. Look at this guy, right? Young. He's got, okay, I admit I'm biased, but look at that hair, that gorgeous hair. A little jealous. Elliot and I think Elliot can sympathize with me on that one. And, you know, he's Jewish. He's kind of dark, but not too dark for the racists, but dark enough. And he's got like, what is that? Like a hoe or something? I don't know. I'm from Highland Park, but it's some kind of farming implement. But unlike me, he knows what he's doing with it. And that's what you're supporting. The new Jew, right? There's 2 more of them. Look how happy they are. throwing seeds and carrying a sickle, right? To sick whatever. Why he has it now isn't that for harvesting? I don't know. It doesn't matter. He's saying Yiddish. Don't ask questions in a story. They're young and happy and farming. That's what you got to know, right? The new Jew. And of course, the new fighting Jew. Again, it's all part of the image. It's not about Palestine, Israel, the state. It's about remaking what it means to be a good Jew. That's the point I'm getting at, right? Here, of course, celebrating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the only Jews celebrated by the Holocaust Jews celebrated by Israel for years. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, everybody else was treated like dirt for being, they had no sense of what the Holocaust was actually about. These Jews, they died fighting. They were the only, that's why, by the way, Yom HaShoah, set on the day the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising broke out. That's the reason for that. Because these were the Holocaust victims Israel was willing to commemorate back in the beginning of the story. Here we have this image. Now, I've done this experiment before. You have here a large, massive, naked Superman carrying a flag with up the mountaintop, and in the background, thousands and thousands of muscular, naked men raising their hand in salute to this Superman. Clearly, if you've ever read your Friedrich Nietzsche, there's a lot of Nietzsche going on here, right? But if I said to you, not knowing your Nietzsche, tell me what political movement or party produced this image. And I've done the experiment, so I'll save you the trouble. Most of the time they answer, it's the fascists. Doesn't it seem fascist? The Superman climbing the mountain with all the background people raising their hands in salute. But of course, it's not fascist. It's one of the Zionist factions. It's the revisionist faction of Zionists who glorify militarism and men and nakedness and all these sorts of things. Fine. So what was, I'm cognizant, what was the religious response? The vast majority of Jews, East and West, North and South, on Earth and Mars, opposed Zionism, right? The Western Jews, whether they're Orthodox or Reform, said, this is insane. We have been screaming for a century. We are members of your nation. We're Americans. We're Englishmen. We're French. We're Germans. And here you come along and say, actually, no, you're Jews. That's your nationality. They hated this. They said, first of all, it's a religious heresy, which it was, but also this is a heresy to everything we've been saying. The original Zionist Congress was supposed to be in Munich, not Basel. It was forced to leave because local rabbis, Reform and Orthodox, who hated each other, who fought about everything, they could at least agree that together they hate the Zionists even more. That much they could agree on. What about in Eastern Europe? And this is my question, your answer to your question, Elliot. Anti-Zionism basically defines orthodoxy for decades in Eastern Europe. First of all, because they saw the movement was inherently secular. Second of all, because there was a tradition that you are forbidden by Jewish law to force God's hand. It's the famous 3 oaths. You cannot do it. You want the Messiah to come, pray more, do more mitzvot. That's how you do it. That's it, right? This is a heresy. And above all else, they see national identity replacing Torah identity from their perspective, Torah. The Zionists say we have the most perfect Torah identity, right? But they would say, no, you're perverting the Torah. Because the new national, I say national, but it's really nationalist rituals, texts, traditions, obligations, community are replacing the traditional ones. They saw that. And one of the leaders of the anti-Zionist tradition back then, and this may be a surprise to some of you, was none other than the 5th Rebbe of Lubavitch, the Rashab. And that might surprise you because you think, oh, Chabad, they're so Zionist. No, they ain't. Now, the last Chabad Rebbe is more confusing, but he was the leader of the anti-Zionists. Look what he writes here. That the Zionists' glory in the name of Israel applies purely to the name of Israel, which to them constitutes Judaism. But from true Judaism, which is the fulfillment of the Torah and the commandments, and faith in the Lord and his holy servants, they are completely distant to the Zionist ideal. May Hashem Yisbarach frustrate their counsel, right? Pretty straightforward. And this is representative of the broad swath of orthodoxy. Now, there were some exceptions. Oh, here's a great quote. I use this in my book, right? Ask us, one of the things I get at is the way the Zionists claim anyone who's not a Zionist is an assimilationist. So Dov Ber Schneerson is an assimilationist because he's anti-Zionist. See, that's the language of Zionism back then and maybe even today, right? If you're not a Zionist, you're an assimilationist. So Rebbe Gudeman, an Orthodox rabbi in Vienna, asked the following questions. Let me ask you, he says, who's more assimilated? The nationally minded Jew who ignores the Sabbath, or the observant Jew who feels himself to be a German, right? Powerful question to ask oneself, to this day, by the way, I would add. And I would say he might have asked, what does it mean to be observant? A Zionist could say, observant, you're not observant. You keep the Sabbath, you keep kosher, but you're not supporting Zionism and moving to Israel. I don't keep kosher, I don't keep the Sabbath, but I'm in Israel and I serve in the army. I'm the observant Jew and you're the heretic. That's the Zionist answer, right? What does it mean to be observant? What's the rituals required? My roommate in Israel told me this is a true story. He was the most observant. This is a man who eats pork and breaks the Sabbath and all. I'm not judging him, just describing him. And he said, I serve in the army, I live in Israel, I'm the most observant Jew, you're the heretic. And I got that from others as well. Because it's a competing denomination of Jewishness. And I'm not judging it. I'm just calling it for what it is, right? There were some religious Zionist responses. You have either, on the one hand, Rabbi Reines, who says, it's not a heresy. We're just trying to get out of Europe because it's dangerous. We still pray for the Messiah. This is not a messianic movement, right? Rabbi Reines, the founder of Mizrahi, in 1903, when the British said, well, you can't have Palestine, how about Uganda? Rabbi Reines said, I vote yay, let's go to Uganda. Rabbi Reines, that guy with the beard and the yarmulke, let's go to Uganda. Because he said it's not about Messiah. When the Messiah comes, we'll go to Israel. We're just trying to get out of Dodge, trying to get out of Europe. It's a bad place, right? Rabbi Cook, of course, most of you know, said, no. This, you better believe this is the messianic process unfolding. And his becomes the more important vision. I have quotes from each of them, but I won't bring them right now. But that's essentially the difference between them. And then Tzvi Yehuda Cook his son goes even farther, but I know the time is late, so I'll skip these quotes for now. But they're wonderful quotes. I have a lot of material. All right, conclusions. Messianic dream is an axiom of rabbinic Judaism. I am not denying this. Only a fool or an ignoramus would deny this. I may be both a fool and ignoramus, but I'm still not going to deny it. It's true. However, nationalism is a modern ideology, and Zionism, in every way, is clearly an example and a product of the modern nationalist era. In every way. It is a modern form of Judaism, or if you prefer, Jewishness, or whatever word you want to use. Like all modern forms of Judaism, whether the various Orthodox forms, conservative, reform, etc., it is a modern ideology that is going to appropriate and reappropriate and arguably misappropriate pre-modern symbols, texts, traditions, rituals, and history to construct its own worldview. And like the other forms, it's going to claim to be the most authentic expression of Judaism. Follow us, and you're into the promised land, quite literally, but also metaphorically. You go the other way, you're a traitor. You're an assimilationist. And that's why I say all Judaisms today are an attempt to claim authenticity in the face of obvious rupture, right? We all have to choose, but all of them are just grasping at straws. They're all picking and choosing. So we pick the one that we feel is most compelling for whatever reasons we pick it. But I end my presentation with the question, how do you achieve pluralism? Because as I told you last week, I am dissatisfied with with either the choice of saying, I accept you as a Jew because you're an idiot, or I respect you as a thinking person and therefore expel you from my midst. I rejected both of those. The solution I suggested was to be cognizant of the fact that we don't know what the hell we're doing, that we're doing the best we can, that modernity has ruptured our identity completely, and we're all just doing the best we can to put it together. And if we have just a modicum of humility that we might be wrong, that if we're Orthodox, the Reform might be right. If we're Reform, the Orthodox might be right. If we're secular Zionist, the religious might be right. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we just have a modicum of humility, it seems to me that will probably be the best way to achieve pluralism that at least respects the other side as being intelligent and thoughtful and caring and so on, without having to expel them as heretics. As if I know, for me to expel someone as a heretic, it means I am 100% sure that my form of Jewishness is correct. And I don't know anyone who should be thinking that. When anyone, I'll end with this. Edgar Keret, the famous Israeli author who I adore, who's just a wonderful author and a wonderful menschy guy, sweet, funny man. So he was giving a lecture at my college, and we all read his books and we prepared for it. And if you've read Edgar Keret, you know that he's most influenced by Franz Kafka, that his books have a lot of absurdity to it and a lot of surrealism. And somebody asked him, why Franz Kafka? Why do you like these short, and they're all short stories, he only writes short stories. Why do you write these ridiculous short stories that are surreal and not based in the real world? And he says, well, it seems to me that people who are most sure of themselves tend to be the ones who cause the most trouble. So I want everyone to feel a little less sure of themselves. And I hope to accomplish that with my stories. So I'm no writer. I can't write like Edgar Keret. So I try in my teaching to make my students at the college be a little less sure of themselves. Even if they still believe, they can believe. I'm not trying to make them rebel against their whole families and so on. Just to be a little doubt, just some doubt that maybe I'm not right. And if they have that much doubt, maybe they'll be a little less likely to cause trouble later on in life. So that's sort of my goal there. All right, so I'll stop here. We have a few minutes, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I'll just invite everyone to unmute yourself. I'm gonna end the share screen so I can see you a little better. Hang on one second. If I can just stop share. There we go. And I'll take questions now if anyone has any. Please, Shelley.
Okay, this is about last week. I wasn't able to be here, but I listened to it, and you didn't mention the fact that even Reform, a lot of it is because almost a third of German Jews were converting to Christianity from 1820 to 1840, and something had to be done with it, and maybe let's make it better for our neighbors, but without the conversion.
So, right, so I would say you're right, but those weren't the numbers. It was a little bit earlier in German history, and it was less than that. It was just the elite. It was a phenomenon among the acculturated elite. So 3, 4, 5% of Jews who were converting. And you're right, part of Reform Judaism was because, why did they convert? They had no model of being a modern Jew. There was no Orthodoxy yet. There was no Reform yet. There was no conservative yet. There was certainly no Zionism yet. There was no model of being an integrated, acculturated, hyphenated German Jew, right? So one of the pushes for Reform Judaism was certainly the idea of saying, here's a model. Here's a way of being a hyphenated German Jew, but not just Reform. I would say the other denominations also. Also, we're trying to give ways of being an authentic, feeling, hyphenated, integrated Jew. So yeah, it's a very good point. I agree with you.
What about what Heine said, though, that conversion was the ticket into the professions and stuff?
Yes, and it was. There's no question. Although the numbers of conversions was quite low. In fact, the later 1800s, this is true, by the way, the liberal Jews, the less religious Jews, were so dedicated to opposing a conversion that they would actually publish blacklists shaming the people who had converted. If you go to the German press of the 1880s and 90s, you'll see often lists of names of Jews who converted to Christianity to shame their parents. So it wasn't that many people. It happened, but it was very much considered a shameful thing to do. But it did happen. It did happen. Yeah, Ira, please.
Yeah, so
the Weisses, family Weiss.
This family Weiss. So I have a little issue with this idea that Zionism is a invention of the 19th century. I think modern political Zionism certainly is a development of the 19th century, but historically, the tie to Zion is so strong from the Bible on, you read every one of the prophets, you know, and the whole idea of Shivat Zion is a very big concept, that the ultimate thing is to get back there because that's our center. And if you read medieval Jewish history, or not medieval, but European Jewish history, there was this sweet longing. There's a Yiddish story about the carobs coming to Europe and the guy eating the carobs, and he talking about him being transported back to, you know, that it was in their mind. It wasn't a political reality. And if you're living in, you know, in some East European shtetl or somewhere in Europe in the Middle Ages, it wasn't a realistic thing. But in the world as it became more modern, the political idea is a modern idea, but the actual impulse
Comes from
I think comes from
Right. So
and I
what I
think
would,
especially, let me just finish, it worries me. I'm an old lady and I'm an old person who used to teach college kids. It worries me not to tell everybody, when you're a Jew who's a learned Jew, that the Jewish connection to Israel is not since colonialism and the 19th century, that the Jewish connection to Israel is old, and that there have always been Jews in Israel. And I think, to me, more important than what we say here talking to each other, is that that idea is very important for our survival. You know,
Yeah,
I'm a Fabrenta Zionist, so it's a whole different
I definitely,
story.
I'm a Fabrenta Apikoris. So anyway, I'll say this. I agree with you. I don't say Zionism is an invention. It's rather a construction. And what I mean by that is, yes, there is in Jewish liturgy and in ideas this connection to the land of Israel and to Jerusalem in a theoretical sense. But the question is, what was the function of that? And for most of Jewish history, it was a messianic function, right? And so the land of Israel wasn't even a real place for most Jews. It was more like you and I would talk about the Garden of Eden. You know, it's a really great line when Reb Nachman of Bratslav got to, you know, he took a pilgrimage to Palestine. And when he got there, he says, I touched the earth. I had no idea it actually would be earth. Like I thought I was going to the Garden of Eden. I had no idea it was a real regular place on planet Earth. And the way most Jews think about it, yeah, someday when they think of it the same way you think of Messiah, is the land of Israel.
But they needed to, because it was a world that you just didn't get on an El Al plane and go to Israel.
That was certainly
unrealistic. It was a prayer that someday this is going to stop, because the diaspora was never the permanent place. No Jewish book
right. So
ever said,
what I would say is,
the Reformers in the 19th century did say that. They said, take out everything about Shivat Zion. But in any kind of a traditional Jewish thought book or prayer book, the question is not to be in the diaspora.
I appreciate your point. The point I would try to make is, what is the significance of that? What does that mean? And what Zionism did was it radically changed the significance of that. And certainly you're right, technology was part of that. But the breakdown of Jewish identity was the biggest part about it. And the Haskalah. You can't have Zionism without the Haskalah, it's impossible. And you can't have Zionism without secularism, it's not possible. You just need those things. So for example,
modern Zionism,
hang on.
modern political Zionism, but there's a difference between modern political Zionism, which is, I believe, what was the subject, what you're talking about, and Zionism, and this tie to Zion.
Well, Zionism was coined in 1893, and it was coined then for a reason, because something new was happening.
But the word Sion,
if I made that choice, if you go back to the newspapers, as I've done, in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s, you will see Zionists, who are all secular, by the way, screaming in 7 languages. I only read 5 of them, but they're screaming week after week after week after week after week. Don't you know you're a nation to whom political rights are due as a nation? And the answer is no. The Jews did not know that because it hadn't been constructed yet. No nation had. So for example, when you have in 1881, when you have Lillian Bloom is sitting in a pogrom, he was actually sitting in it, he was imagining it, but whatever. And he says, oh my God, God of Israel, how long must we suffer in this pogrom until we have to take up the sword? He said at one point, I'm suffering with my people and I'm better for it. I'm suffering with the people and I'm one of the people. Nobody talks that way before the 1880s without the impact of the Narodnika movement of the Russian populace of the 1870s. You need to have the 1870s, the Narodnika movement, and then you can have Zionism in the 1880s. In 1648, there were pogroms across Ukraine. Something like 18 or 24,000 Jews were killed in the Khmelnytsky pogroms. And nobody said, I'm glad I suffered. Nobody said, I'm one of the people. Nobody said, let's get out of here and go to Palestine. Nobody thought that way because it was a pre-modern world. It was a different mindset. So what changes is the epistemology.
Right.
The epistemology is radically transformed over the course of the 1800s. And yes, it's going to take that building block. And I'll end with this before I give somebody else the next question. You know, there's a famous book about nations called Imagined Communities by a guy named Benedict Anderson, a very important, influential book, Imagined Communities, where he explains that nations are imagined communities and why they're imagined communities and why they had to be born in the 1800s. And then about, 5-10 years later, he wrote an essay and he said, you guys misunderstood me. I wasn't saying they were imagined to say they weren't real. I wasn't saying the building blocks were fake. I was saying that they were building them and constructing them in a new way. And only now were they doing it. So that's different. And that's why I say Orthodoxy, they're not making it up. You know, when they say this is Judaism, Reform is not making it up. They have proof texts. They pick and choose proof texts just like the Orthodox. The Orthodox Jews today, they have trouble with a whole lot of mitzvot and a whole lot of verses. And I don't want to go on to a Lashon Hora spree, but you and I both know that the Orthodox world struggles with things that the Reform world does not, and vice versa, and vice versa. So everyone is struggling and everyone is choosing. And I think the best attitude is to realize that world is gone and everyone's making a claim. And your claim is the claim of the Zionists, but it's not historically accurate. It is there, this longing, but it didn't mean that. Just like Chadash Asur Min Torah didn't mean you couldn't speak English, like the Chasam Sofer said. It didn't mean that. It simply didn't. Just like the Midrash, that the ancient Israelites were redeemed from Egypt because they spoke their own language and dressed differently and kept Jewish names, right? That's the famous Midrash. They didn't acculturate. The ancient slaves, they worshipped idols, they committed incest and adultery and all sorts of things, but they didn't acculturate. That's why the Midrash says they were redeemed. That does not mean that you and I can't acculturate, right? It just doesn't mean that. But the ultra-Orthodox say it does. It does mean that. They have a verse. They have a text. God bless them. It's not for me, but you know, they have a text. So that's all. That's what I would argue. Is I think it's important for Zionists to see the perspective of non-Zionists and vice versa. For Reform to see the perspective of Orthodox and vice versa. It seems to me, anyway, my own perspective. But like I said, I don't claim to have any chachma, just a shtickle of courses. Elliot, I think, with the hand.
Josh, again, I think like Myra, I'm struggling with the some of the concepts. And would it be fair to sort of characterize or describe it as prior to the Haskalah, right? I mean, you said the Messianic dream is axiomatic, right? And Lashon Haba B'Yerushalayim is a text that goes back to before the Enlightenment, et cetera, et cetera. But that prior to the Enlightenment, et cetera, while there was this yearning for Zion, it was not something around which Jews organized in a collective political fashion.
For sure not.
What I'm hearing is that after the Haskalah, that idea and those texts and the culture around yearning for Zion became a political movement, whereas before it was an aspect of Jewish life and thought and practice. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's somewhat true. I would say a couple things, though. First of all, way after the Haskalah, so 60, 70, 80 years later. So it takes time to germinate. But the other thing I would say is a lot of Zionism, if you look at the Zionists, you know, often I hear people say, American Zionists aren't real Zionists. and Ben Gurion would have said this and did say this, right? Why aren't they real Zionists? Why is everybody in this room, I'm assuming no one's here from Israel because it's like 4 a.m. there. I assume you're all in America. Everyone here is a fake Zionist. Why are we fake Zionists? Because we didn't move to Israel, right? We're not real Zionists. What does it mean for us to be a Zionist? What it means is it's our identity. It's a way for us to understand what it means to be a Jew, right? That's what it was 100 years ago too. What America is today is fully in the Zionist tradition. There's nothing for anyone on this group to be ashamed about. That's exactly what Zionism was 100 years ago. It was a bunch of Jews who felt, what does it mean to me to be Jewish? I don't feel, it's not enough to be religious. Maybe I'm not, for the most part, I'm not religious, or I am, but it's not so important to me. And Zionism is a way for me to express that kind of ethnic identity. And it was still a dual identity, right? The Zionists in Poland and Austria, even in Russia, in Germany, England, America, they felt proud of their local identity as well. But Zionism was able to enhance that in some way. Palestine, the land of Israel, it was symbolic. The vast majority had no intention of ever going there. They didn't even care if it was a state there. The whole idea of a state was like 1940, right? 1940, very late. It was all about the symbol of it. Because we have this symbol, ancient times, we were a national group, that gives us pride today sitting in Vienna. That gives us pride today sitting in Berlin, sitting in Lviv, sitting in Warsaw, or Cincinnati, or New York, or Charleston, whatever. Skokie. So what we're doing now in America is fully in that tradition, right? And I think that's great. We just should be aware of it, right? It's not about the longing for us to go back to Israel. It's just not about that. It certainly wasn't 100 years ago. That's why I say the Zionist Austria, fully 2/3. Any of you Galicianers, raise your hand if you're a Galician or come from Galician background. Dr. Weiss, that's very brave of you to admit. I'm proud of you for that. Man after my own heart. I joke because there's a lot of stereotypes of Galicianers being backwards people, but it's bogus. The Galicianers were leaders in Haskalah, in rabbinic scholarship, in Hasidic leadership, in socialist leadership. In Zion, 2/3 of the men, and they're almost all men, who attended the first Zionist Congress were Galicianers. Did you know that, Dr. Weiss?
I will tell you that my great-grandfather was a cheder teacher in Tarnow.
That's where Sala Baron is from.
And there were three little cheders for the students, and it's written up in one of the chronicle books that outlines the three cheders. One was very strict and very dogmatic and very close to the law. Another was in between. In his cheder, they went outside to milk the goats for lunch, and taught the boys how to make things and do things. Many of them went off to be chalutzim. They were therefore spared Hitler.
Yes.
His students as a body reconvened in 1960 to talk about what it was like to be his cheder student and how they left.
Okay. First of all, everyone forgive me. Dr. Weiss, you need to know two things. Number one, the famous historian Salo Baron, the most famous American historian of the 20th century, is from Tarnov, and he wrote a memoir about his time growing up there, which you are now obligated to go find and read. And number two, there is a wonderful Yizkor book about Tarnov, written in Hebrew and Yiddish, that you are obligated to go read. Perhaps you own it. You're muted, so I can't hear you. But
I own the one about Dembitsa, a neighboring community. But
Tarnov.
Yeah.
A little Galician pride. Tarnov has its own Yizkor book. I have a copy myself.
I'll be reading it tomorrow.
All scanned and online. Hey, wherever you're from, the Yizkor books, there's over 900 of them. They've all been scanned by the New York Public Library. And you can go find out about your hometowns from your ancestors. It's a wonderful resource. So Tarnov, you touched my heart. But I tell you, the Galician Jews had no intention for the most part, with the Chalutzim with the exception. They weren't going anywhere. And by the way, if you've been to Galicia, and I've been many times, it's stunningly beautiful. I don't blame them for not leaving. It was really nice, really beautiful. And they had no intention of leaving, no matter how much anti-Semitism. They had no intention of leaving there. They loved it there. It was beautiful. So Zionism back then also was a form of expressing Jewishness by drawing selectively on some traditions and ignoring others. I'll end with this story. I know it's late. I can keep going, but I know that some of you have to go. I was once, I was Chabad. For many, many years, I was Chabadnik. And coming home from Israel in maybe 2002, I was the only religious person on a plane of 400 because I was stupid enough to pick a flight that landed 1 hour before Shabbos in New York. I was a stupid kid, what can I tell you? And I'm on this plane, 400 people, and the plane takes off, whatever, and then the bell goes off. You can get up now. And being a Chabadnik, what's the first thing I do? I ask every single man on the plane to put on tefillin, without fail. And most of them said no. Some of them had some choice words for me. I could take it. A few of them said yes. The guy next to me had been talking to me, and he said, why don't you move? This was a classical Zionist, like out of a novel. He had 2 children. One was named Ben Sion, and the other was named Sabrina from Sabra. Like, if I wrote a book with these people, you'd say, Josh, that's over the top. Nobody is that Zionist anymore. No, this was a true story. They moved, like dancing the horror on the plane, right? They're living in a kibbutz somewhere, right? They were born 50 years too late. So they're in Israel with Ben Sion and Sabrina. And he says to me, why don't you move to Israel? And I said, well, I have no family, no friends, no money, no job. I'm very close to my parents and 4 brothers. And frankly, I don't really like it there that much. It's kind of a foreign country. I'm from a smaller town. It's very New York. And, I just don't want to live there. And he says, you're a bad Jew. You're a heretic. You're a hypocrite. Why are you a hypocrite? Because there's a mitzvah to move to the land of Israel, even giving up your entire career for which you've trained 7 years. Give it up. Dig ditches if you have to. Live anywhere. Give up your family. Give up everything because there's a mitzvah. Now, some of you know there's a machlokes Ramban if there's actually a mitzvah to move to Israel. It may be a mitzvah or maybe a nice thing to do. It's not clear. But one thing I do know, putting on tefillin every day is a mitzvah. That much I know. Not only is a mitzvah, I can't think of a single rabbinic authority who would tell you if you had a choice to move to Israel or put on tefillin, that putting on tefillin isn't the more important mitzvah. It's clearly the more important mitzvah from an Orthodox perspective, from a traditional perspective. So I said to him, on this 10-hour flight where he can go nowhere and there is nothing to do but to watch bad movies, and it wasn't even the little screens. It was just one movie for all of us in those days on the screen in front of us. And I said, would you like to put on tefillin? It only takes 2 minutes. He said, no, thank you. No, thank you. He had no interest. That's what I mean when I say it's a denomination. I am a hypocrite and a heretic because I don't give up my life to move to Israel. He does not have 2 minutes to put on tefillin. I want to emphasize, I'm not judging him. I'm really not. He was a good man, I'm sure. And, people put on tefillin, don't put on tefillin. It's none of my business. And I'm truly, sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, not judging him. However, I think it does illustrate the point I'm making, right? The way that for him, a good Jew, the mitzvah that's important is moving to Israel and naming your kids Ben Sion and Sabrina. And for me, at that time anyway, maybe to a certain extent to this day, being a good Jew means putting on tefillin and saying Shema, right? And by the way, it's a lot more cost effective and less painful. So, that's what I mean when I think about denomination, And I'm not judging. Maybe he's right. Oh, hello. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am a bad Jew because I haven't moved to Israel. Maybe the Zionists have it right. And I'll find out after, if I'm lucky, 120, God will say, I sent you all these signals and you should have come to Israel and you didn't. So you're going down to Gehenna. I don't know, but we'll find out. At least I put on tefillin this morning. That's all I can say. Anyway.
No for Rabbeinu Tam.
I sold my Rabbeinu Tams when I left Chabad, I have to admit. But I'll tell you this, if that's what does me in, if I'm kept out of Olam Haba because I'm not wearing Rabbeinu Tam, then forget it. Because I wouldn't eat their shechita anyway. Because I don't touch Chabad shechita, so forget about it. So,
I met David Ben Gurion, may he rest in peace, when I was a young woman, and he was giving a speech, and he said that you cannot possibly consider yourself a full Jew unless you live in Israel, and that you cannot call yourself a Zionist if you don't live in Israel, because that it exists now,
Yeah.
and so there's no excuse. And he talked about how, if a Jew didn't build your house, I mean, these were back in the days
Yeah.
when the Jews were building the houses and the roads and things,
Right.
and that's what made you a full Jew,
Yeah,
and you didn't have a claim.
that's
you
right.
know,
I
so
I tell you even more.
that I really heard with my ears. So
He said even more than that. He said, now that we have in Israel, the rest of the Jews have 10 years to come and then we cut them off. Then we're done with them. They're not Jews anymore. He pulled back from that when he realized American Jews had something to offer. But that was his original response. Screw them. They come now, they got 10 years. After that, feh. Yeah, that's David Ben-Gurion. Zichrono livracha. All right, Elliot, thank you for the invitation. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Josh. This was great. Does anyone have any final questions or what have you for Josh? If not, I'm sure
If
Josh
not, I'll be in Shul on Shabbos.
can email, and God willing, we'll be back in shul in a safe fashion, and we can schmooze over a l'chaim at Kiddush.
God may be here, all right.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Good
It was a
night.
pleasure. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you, it was fun.
Great.
Thanks, Josh. Good job.
he left. Very nice. It was excellent, excellent.